Was he the deadliest tank commander Germany ever put into the field? Some historians say Otto Carius destroyed more than 150 enemy tanks. Others say the true number was closer to 100, maybe less, and that even Carius himself, decades later, waved away the mythology that had grown up around his name. What is beyond dispute is this: a sickly, underweight teenager who was twice rejected by the German army for being physically unfit, went on to become one of the most feared Tiger tank commanders on the Eastern Front. A young lieutenant who fought his way through the siege lines of Narva, the burning villages of Latvia, and the collapsing pocket of the Ruhr, and who somehow, against every reasonable expectation, survived it all. He would be shot through the leg, the arm, hit 4 times in the back, and shot through the neck, and he would still walk away. He would face down entire columns of Soviet armor with nothing but a pair of Tigers and a handful of nerve. And after the war, instead of vanishing into obscurity like so many of his contemporaries, he would open a small pharmacy in a quiet German village, name it after his old tank, and spend the next 60 years as one of the most quietly famous men in the country. How does a boy nobody wanted in uniform become a legend of armoured warfare? And how does a legend of armoured warfare end up behind a pharmacy counter for half a century? In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning. Otto Carius was born on May 27, 1922, in the town of Zweibrücken, in the Palatinate region of southwestern Germany, close to the border with France. His father was a schoolteacher, a disciplined and educated man who would later serve as a reserve major in the German army during the very war his son would come to fight, and who reportedly regarded the new armoured branch of the Wehrmacht with open suspicion, dismissing tanks as nothing more than metal death traps. His mother kept the household, and young Otto grew up in a modest, orderly middle-class home that placed a high value on discipline and education. As a boy, Carius was drawn not to soldiering but to music. He was an accomplished cellist and pianist, and for a time it seemed as though he might pursue a career in the arts rather than the military, or perhaps in mechanical engineering, a field that fascinated him almost as much as music did. But history had other plans. World War II broke out in September 1939, just as Carius was finishing his schooling, and like so many young men of his generation, he found himself swept toward the front lines, whether he wanted to go or not. Here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn, one of those lesser-known details that makes Carius's rise all the more remarkable. He tried to enlist twice, and twice he was turned away. The reason given on his rejection papers was blunt and almost comic in hindsight: not fit for service, underweight. The German army, in the opening months of the war, looked at this thin, slight young man and decided he simply did not have the physical bulk to be a soldier. It would have been easy, at that point, for Carius to drift into a different life entirely. Instead, he kept trying. Finally, in May 1940, just as German forces were smashing through France in the campaign that would end with the fall of Paris, Carius was accepted into the 104th Infantry Replacement Battalion. He arrived by train in Posen only days after the invasion of France had begun, eager, by his own later account, to prove that the army's earlier assessment of him had been wrong. His first taste of military life was in the infantry, the branch his own father had served in, and one that seemed on paper a natural fit for a young recruit without any specialized skills. But Carius quickly grew restless. He wanted something else, something faster and more dangerous, and in the autumn of 1940 he volunteered for the Panzer branch, the armoured corps that his father had so distrusted. It was a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was sent to Vaihingen, near Stuttgart, where he reported to the 7th Panzer Replacement Battalion, and from there to the training grounds at Putlos in Holstein, in the north of Germany, where new panzer crews learned the fundamentals of armoured warfare, gunnery, radio procedure, tactics, and the brutal mechanical realities of operating a tank in combat. It was tough, technical training, and Carius, the boy once rejected for being too frail to hold a rifle, threw himself into it. By the time his unit was integrated into the newly formed 21st Panzer Regiment, he was ready, at least on paper, for war. In June 1941, Carius's regiment was moved east to East Prussia, part of the enormous build-up of German forces along the Soviet frontier that would culminate on June 22, 1941, in Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. Carius went into Russia as a loader on a Panzer 38T, a light Czech-designed tank that had been absorbed into German service after the annexation of Czechoslovakia, serving with Panzer Regiment 21, part of the 20th Panzer Division. It was not the machine that would make him famous, but it was where he learned his trade, crammed into a cramped, poorly armoured turret, feeding shells to the gunner while the tank rattled across the vast, dusty roads of the Soviet Union. The early weeks of Barbarossa were a story of stunning German success. Soviet defences collapsed in front of the advancing panzer columns, entire armies were encircled, and it seemed to many German soldiers that the campaign might be over before winter. But that early optimism would not survive contact with reality for long. Carius's division pushed toward Vitebsk and then on toward the Smolensk-Moscow highway, a vital artery for any advance on the Soviet capital. By mid-July 1941, his unit had reached Yartsevo on that same highway, where it ran headlong into determined Soviet resistance. The fighting around Yartsevo and, soon after, around Yelnya to the southeast of Smolensk was brutal and unglamorous, a world away from the triumphant newsreel footage of German tanks racing across open steppe. On July 8, 1941, in the fighting near Vitebsk, Carius was wounded, one of the very first of what would eventually become a long and grim list of injuries sustained over the course of the war. It was not a severe wound, but it was a foretaste of what lay ahead, and it earned him the Wound Badge in Black, awarded on August 2nd of that year. Around the same time, in a moment that stuck with him for the rest of his life, his radio operator lost an arm in combat, a stark reminder that the men who fought inside these steel boxes were never as protected as their armour plating suggested. The defensive fighting around Yelnya dragged on through late July and into August, grinding, costly, and utterly unlike the swift war of movement that had characterized the invasion's opening days. It was in the midst of this fighting, on August 1st, 1941, that Carius was promoted to Unteroffizier, a junior non-commissioned rank, recognition of his performance under fire. But his ambitions extended further. He was selected as an officer candidate and sent back to Germany, to Wunsdorf near Berlin, to attend officer training, a demanding course that would determine whether the underweight boy who had twice been rejected for basic service could rise to lead other men in combat. Here the story takes another unexpected turn, one that Carius himself would later describe with a certain wry honesty rather than pride. He failed the course. On February 2nd, 1942, Carius washed out of officer candidate training, a setback that could easily have ended any hope of advancement and sent him back to the front as an ordinary non-commissioned officer, one face among thousands in the vast grinding machine of the German army in Russia. And return to the front he did. By mid-February 1942, Carius was back with his regiment near Gzhatsk, northeast of Vyazma, and what he found there shocked him. The division he had left behind only months earlier had been nearly decimated by the ferocious winter fighting that followed the failure of the German advance on Moscow. The euphoria of the summer campaign was gone, replaced by frostbite, exhaustion, and the grim realization that the war in the east was going to be far longer and far more costly than anyone in the German high command had predicted. For a time, Carius served in less glamorous roles, at one point working as a platoon leader in an engineering platoon attached to a headquarters company, and later managing an officers' club in Paderborn, assignments that, on their face, seemed to be quietly sidelining a young soldier whose combat career had stalled after his failure at officer school. But it was precisely in this unglamorous posting that fortune intervened. At the officers' club, Carius struck up a friendship with an officer who would go on to command the 2nd Company of the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion, a unit that was, at that very moment, being equipped with a revolutionary new weapon, the Tiger. The Tiger tank, formerly the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger, had entered service in late 1942, and it represented a quantum leap in armoured firepower and protection. Armed with the devastating 88mm gun, a weapon originally designed for anti-aircraft use but repurposed with lethal effect against enemy armour and protected by frontal armour that could shrug off hits from most Soviet tank guns of the period, the Tiger was slow, mechanically finicky, and expensive to produce, but on the battlefield it was, for a time, nearly unstoppable when used correctly. For a young officer candidate whose career seemed to have quietly stalled, the chance to join a Tiger battalion was, in Carius's own recollection, nothing short of a gift from heaven. He was assigned as a platoon leader of a Tiger company, a role that would give wings, quite literally in the unit's own symbolism, to a career that had nearly disappeared entirely. It was, as Carius himself would later describe it in his memoirs, the beginning of a legend. The 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion, known formally as Schwer Panzer Abteilung 502, was one of the first units in the entire German army to be equipped with the new Tiger tanks, and it was deployed to the northern sector of the Eastern Front, in the marshy, forested terrain around Leningrad, a city that had been under German and Finnish siege since September 1941. By June 1943, Carius, now a lieutenant, had been given command of the 2nd Company of the 502nd, one of the very first units anywhere to field this new generation of heavy armour. The terrain around Leningrad was treacherous for tanks, crisscrossed by rivers, bogs and dense forest, and the fighting there had none of the sweeping, open-country drama of the earlier Barbarossa campaigns. It was a war of ambush and counter-ambush, of tanks dug in behind earthworks, of infantry support and artillery duels, and it demanded a very different kind of skill from the one Carius had learned as a loader on a light tank 2 years earlier. But what would become of this once-rejected recruit now that he commanded some of the most powerful tanks in the German arsenal? The answer would unfold over the following year in a series of engagements that would transform Otto Carius from an obscure lieutenant into one of the most celebrated tank aces of the entire war. Engagements fought in defence of a bridgehead most people outside of military history circles have never heard of, against a Soviet military machine that was growing larger, better equipped, and more experienced with every passing month. The easy victories of 1941 were a distant memory. What lay ahead for Carius and his Tigers was a different kind of war entirely, one measured not in miles of territory gained, but in tanks destroyed. One at a time, at ranges sometimes as short as a few hundred yards, with death waiting on every side of the armoured hull that separated Carius from the battlefield beyond. By late 1943 and into the opening weeks of 1944, the German position around Leningrad was beginning to crumble. Soviet forces, reinforced and re-equipped after 2.5 years of brutal attrition warfare, launched a major offensive in January 1944 that finally broke the long siege of the city and sent German forces reeling backward toward the pre-war Estonian border. It was in this collapsing situation that Carius and his Tiger Company found themselves thrown into some of the most intense fighting of his entire career, fighting that would take place along a river called the Narva, at a city of the same name, on a stretch of front that German propaganda would soon come to call the gateway to the Reich. Carius arrived in Narva by train in early January 1944, and what awaited him there was a battle of almost mythic intensity, one that would come to be remembered by some historians as the Battle of the European SS, given the extraordinary mixture of German Wehrmacht units, Waffen-SS formations, and volunteer legions from across occupied Europe that converged there to hold the line against the advancing Red Army. It was here, in the bridgehead east of Narva and along the so-called Tannenberg Line to the west of the city, that Otto Carius would begin to earn the reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. The Narva bridgehead was, in early 1944, one of the most heavily contested pieces of ground on the entire Eastern Front. Adolf Hitler himself had declared that the line had to be held at all costs, both for strategic reasons and for propaganda purposes, since a collapse there would open the road directly into the Baltic states and eventually toward East Prussia itself. Field Marshal Walter Model, newly appointed to command Army Group North and already earning a reputation as Hitler's favourite troubleshooter for desperate situations, personally arrived at the front in early February 1944 and gave Carius a blunt and almost impossible order: stop the Russian tanks, and do it without losing a single Tiger. It was the kind of directive that sounded simple on paper and proved brutally difficult in execution, but Carius set about trying to fulfill it with a combination of caution, aggression, and a keen understanding of how to use his heavy tanks defensively, husbanding his handful of precious Tigers rather than throwing them away in reckless attacks. On February 12, 1944, in the fighting east of Narva, Carius destroyed 4 more Soviet tanks defending the bridgehead, adding to a growing personal tally that his superiors and, eventually, the wider German propaganda apparatus would begin to take notice of. 4 days later, on February 16th, a massive Soviet assault struck the German lines between Narva and the Baltic coast, and Carius, commanding just 2 Tigers, moved to support a hard-pressed infantry commander named Wengler, whose positions were being overrun. It was exactly the kind of engagement the Tiger had been designed for. A small number of heavily armed vehicles used to blunt a much larger attacking force, plugging gaps in the line wherever the pressure was greatest. The German defenders along the Narva front settled into positions along the river itself by February 24th, and for a brief stretch in March, as Soviet attacks temporarily slackened, Carius and his exhausted crews were even given a few days of rest, complete with access to a sauna near the coastal town of Sillamäe, a small human detail that stands in sharp contrast to the violence surrounding them on every side. That rest did not last. On March 17, 1944, a massive Soviet artillery bombardment signaled the opening of a new offensive, and within 2 days the headquarters area where Carius was stationed came under direct attack from 6 T-34 tanks supported by anti-tank guns. Carius and his crews fought off the assault, a small but telling victory that boosted morale among the badly stretched German defenders. 2 days later, on March 19th, near a position called Lembitu, Soviet forces attempted to encircle German troops in the Narva sector with a flanking movement from the west, and once again, Carius's Tigers were in the thick of it, knocking out several more T-34s in the process. On March 22nd, Soviet forces attempted an amphibious landing along the coast northeast of Narva at a village called Merikula, hoping to open a second front behind German lines. By the time Carius arrived to meet the threat, the landing force had already been destroyed by other German units, but the episode underscored just how desperate and inventive the Soviet High Command had become in its efforts to break the deadlock at Narva. By the end of March 1944, both the Tigers and their crews desperately needed maintenance and rest, the constant mechanical strain of combat operations having taken a heavy toll on the complex and temperamental machines. But the respite was brief. On April 6, 1944, the Germans launched a counterattack of their own, known as Operation Strachwitz, after the aristocratic and famously aggressive Panzer commander Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz von Groß-Zaucher und Kamenetz, who had been brought in to organize a mobile armored reserve capable of striking back against Soviet penetrations. Carius worked closely with Strachwitz's battle group during this period, and on April 15th, in a planning session ahead of a third phase of the operation, Carius was present when Strachwitz himself was awarded the diamonds to his Knight's Cross, one of the rarest and most prestigious decorations in the entire German military honours system, a striking reminder of the calibre of officer Carius now found himself serving alongside. 4 days later, on April 19th, the third phase of Operation Strachwitz was launched, and on April 20th, in the fighting that followed, Carius himself was wounded again, though not seriously enough to remove him from the front. The operation concluded on April 23rd without significant German territorial gains, a sobering illustration of just how difficult it had become, even for skilled and aggressive commanders, to reverse the strategic tide on the Eastern Front by the spring of 1944. Despite the operation's limited results, Carius's own performance during the winter and spring fighting around Narva had not gone unnoticed. On May 4, 1944, at Pskov, Carius was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military decorations, in recognition of his actions in the Narva sector between March 17th and March 22nd of that year, the very stretch of fighting described above. It was a remarkable achievement for a man who, less than 4 years earlier, had been rejected from military service for being underweight and who had subsequently failed his officer candidate course entirely. A little over a month later, on June 6, 1944, as Allied forces were storming ashore at Normandy on the opposite side of the continent, Carius received a personal letter of congratulation from General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armoured warfare doctrine and one of the most respected military minds in the Wehrmacht, congratulating him on his Knight's Cross. For a young lieutenant who had spent the first years of the war fighting as an anonymous loader and later languishing in administrative postings after washing out of officer school, it was validation on the highest possible level. But the war on the Eastern Front had no patience for celebration. Even as Carius travelled to Berlin to formally apply for reinstatement with the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion, riding in a car with SS officers, he heard over the radio a report of an incoming air raid and had to evacuate to an overpass to take shelter, watching with his own eyes as American bombers droned overhead on their way to targets deeper inside the Reich. It was a vivid, almost surreal juxtaposition, a decorated tank ace forced to hide from an air raid on the streets of the German capital, even as his name was being celebrated in official communiques. By late June 1944, Carius was back with his unit, and on June 24th, his company took part in an attack against a Soviet-held position that German troops had nicknamed the Judennass, or Jew's Nose, a grim wartime nickname reflecting the casual and often dehumanizing language that permeated the German military at every level, even as men like Carius focused their attention on the immediate tactical business of survival and combat effectiveness. The greater catastrophe unfolding behind the front lines, in the ghettos and camps where the Nazi regime was carrying out its campaign of industrialized murder, existed in a different and even darker register than the tank battles Carius fought. And it is worth pausing to remember that the war he experienced from inside a Tiger's armoured hull was only one small piece of a much larger and more terrible history. On July 2nd, 1944, the battalion was transported by rail to Daugavpils, a city in eastern Latvia known to the Germans by its older name Düneberg, and a critical rail and road junction whose loss would open the way for a further Soviet advance into the Baltic states. The Tigers arrived and assembled on the southern bank of the Daugava River, roughly 8 kilometers south of the city, bracing for what all sides understood would be a major confrontation as the Soviet summer offensive, codenamed Operation Bagration, continued to shatter German Army Group Center and threatened to unhinge the entire German position in the east. On July 11, 1944, near a location called Karasino, Carius's unit clashed with advancing Soviet forces, and in the fighting, his own gunner, a young soldier named Rudolf Zweti, was wounded, a reminder that even a battle-hardened crew commanded by a Knight's Cross holder was never immune to the constant attrition of frontline combat. 3 days later, on July 14th, Carius captured the village of Bolnaret, north of Karasino, during a night operation before withdrawing back to friendlier positions, and on July 15th, near the village of Maruga, he was attached to a larger battle group and awarded the Tank Combat Badge, 2nd level, a decoration given for repeated participation in armoured engagements. What none of the men in Carius's company could have known as the middle days of July 1944 ticked by in a haze of skirmishes, night marches and constant vigilance was that the single most famous and most fiercely debated engagement of Otto Carius's entire military career was now only days away, waiting for him on the outskirts of a small, unremarkable Latvian village called Malinova. Before following Carius into that engagement, it is worth pausing to understand exactly what set him and his fellow Tiger commanders apart from the vast majority of tank crews fighting on either side of the Eastern Front. The Tiger One weighed in at close to 57 tons, dwarfing the Soviet T-34, which weighed roughly half that. Its frontal armour, sloped less aggressively than that of the T-34 but far thicker, could withstand hits from most Soviet tank and anti-tank guns at anything but point-blank range, while its 88mm main gun could punch through the armour of almost any Allied tank at distances exceeding a mile. In the hands of a skilled crew operating from a well-chosen defensive position, a single Tiger could account for a dozen or more enemy tanks before being knocked out itself, and it was precisely this kind of lopsided, defensively minded engagement that Carius had learned to master during his time at Narva. But the Tiger was far from a perfect weapon. It was mechanically complex and prone to breakdowns. Its overlapping road wheels were notorious for becoming clogged with mud and ice in the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front, and its sheer weight meant that many bridges simply could not support it, forcing crews to ford rivers or take long detours whenever the terrain demanded it. Fuel consumption was enormous, and a battalion of Tigers required a logistical tale of fuel trucks, spare parts, and recovery vehicles that was often difficult to maintain amid the chaos of a retreating front. Carius, by his own account and by the recollections of the men who served under him, was not a reckless commander in the mould of some of the more flamboyant panzer aces whose exploits filled German wartime newsreels. He was careful, methodical, and deeply attentive to terrain, to sightlines, and the discipline of his crews, preferring to let the enemy come to him whenever possible, rather than charging blindly into unknown territory. He frequently went ahead of his own company on reconnaissance missions, often in a commandeered Kübelwagen, the light, rugged German military vehicle that served a role roughly similar to the American Jeep, scouting the ground personally before committing his precious and irreplaceable Tigers to any engagement. This habit of forward reconnaissance would serve him brilliantly time and again throughout 1944, allowing him to identify Soviet dispositions before they were even aware of his presence. It would also, as we will soon see, very nearly cost him his life. The men who crewed Carius's Tiger were, like tank crews on every side of the war, bound together by a peculiar and intense camaraderie, forged in the shared experience of combat inside a machine that was at once an incredibly powerful weapon, and from the perspective of the men riding inside it, a potential steel coffin. A Tiger crew numbered 5 men: the commander, who sat in the turret and directed the tank's movements and fire; the gunner, seated below and slightly forward of the commander, responsible for aiming and firing the main gun; the loader, who fed shells into the breach, often working in a cramped space barely large enough to turn around in; and, down in the hull, the driver and the radio operator, who also typically manned a hull machine gun. These 5 men lived, fought, and often died together, and the bonds between them were often stronger than those between soldiers in almost any other branch of service. Carius's own writings and the recollections gathered by later historians consistently emphasize how much he relied on and trusted his crew, in particular his close friend and fellow Tiger commander Albert Kirscher, who would fight alongside him in some of the most dramatic engagements of the coming weeks. It was this bond and this instinct for using ground and cover intelligently rather than simply charging headlong into the enemy that Otto Carius would draw on in the searing July heat of 1944 as the Soviet summer offensive rolled westward and threatened to swallow his entire battalion whole. Before turning to that final, desperate stretch of the Daugavpils campaign, it is worth stepping back to understand the broader unit history of the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion, because Otto Carius did not achieve his reputation in isolation. He was one product, albeit an unusually successful one, of a battalion that had been fighting almost continuously in the most difficult terrain on the entire Eastern Front since the autumn of 1942. The 502nd had been formed at Bamberg in Bavaria in May 1942, becoming the very first unit in the German army to receive the new Tiger tank, with its initial 4 vehicles arriving at the Leningrad front in August of that year, even before the Tiger had been fully proven in combat anywhere else. Those early months were brutal and unglamorous, plagued by mechanical breakdowns in the same swampy, forested terrain around Lake Ladoga that would frustrate German heavy armour throughout the entire Leningrad campaign. On September 16, 1942, the battalion took its Tigers into combat for the first time south of Lake Ladoga, and within days had already suffered its first total loss, a Tiger bogged down in mud and ultimately destroyed by its own crew, rather than allow it to fall into Soviet hands intact, an inauspicious beginning for what would eventually become one of the most successful heavy tank battalions of the entire war. The battalion's fortunes improved considerably through the first months of 1943. Between January 12th and March 31st of that year, one company of the 502nd destroyed an extraordinary 160 Soviet tanks, while losing only 6 of its own Tigers, a kill ratio of nearly 27-1 that stands as one of the most lopsided sustained combat records of the entire war, and one that illustrates just how devastating the Tiger could be when employed defensively in terrain that channeled attacking Soviet armour into narrow, well-covered killing zones. This success came at a cost in leadership, however. The battalion lost its first company commander, killed in action on January 15, 1943, and several days later, during a desperate attempt to escape encirclement at Schlüsselburg, the battalion lost 4 Panzer IIIs and 5 Tigers in a single day, 2 of which had to be deliberately destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture, while one, chillingly, fell into Soviet hands completely intact and was subsequently studied in exhaustive detail by Soviet engineers at the Kubinka Proving Grounds, providing invaluable intelligence that would help shape later generations of Soviet tank design, specifically intended to counter the Tiger's advantages. Throughout the remainder of 1943, the 502nd continued its grinding defensive campaign around Leningrad, fighting through the Third Battle of Lake Ladoga in July and August, before being pulled back to cover the German withdrawal from the Leningrad sector, taking up positions around Newell in Belarus during November and December of that year. It was sometime during this extended period of continuous combat, amid the marshes, forests, and increasingly desperate defensive fighting of the Leningrad front, that Otto Carius, freshly arrived from his earlier administrative postings, began to make his mark as a platoon leader within the battalion's 2nd Company, learning the trade of heavy tank combat alongside seasoned veterans and steadily building the reputation for careful, terrain-conscious tactical thinking that would define his entire subsequent career. He was not the battalion's only rising star during this period. Johannes Bölter, eventually credited with well over 100 tank kills of his own, and Albert Kirscher, Carius's close friend and battlefield partner, who would eventually be credited with more than 100 kills in his own right, were both members of the same close-knit company, alongside other skilled gunners and commanders like Heinz Kramer, whose marksmanship Carius would come to rely on heavily in the engagements ahead. The 502nd, in other words, was not a battalion with a single standout ace surrounded by anonymous supporting cast, but a genuinely elite formation that, almost uniquely among German armoured units of the period, managed to concentrate an extraordinary density of skilled, experienced tank commanders within a single, relatively small unit. A concentration of talent that helps explain the battalion's staggering aggregate combat record by war's end. A claimed total approaching 1,400 enemy tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed across its entire operational history. January 1944 brought renewed crisis as Soviet forces launched the offensive that would finally and permanently break the siege of Leningrad. Striking out from the Iranian-bound bridgehead west of the city, the 502nd was rushed south to Gatchina in a desperate effort to help contain the breakout. The fighting that followed was some of the most chaotic and costly the battalion had yet experienced. Around the village of Siaskilevo, 11 Tigers were completely destroyed in a matter of days, and the commander of the battalion's 3rd Company, finding his position surrounded and hopeless, chose suicide rather than surrender, a stark and sobering illustration of just how desperate the fighting on the northern sector of the Eastern Front had become by the opening weeks of 1944. On January 20th, the battalion's commanding officer, Major Willy Jede, worked frantically alongside his corps commander to organize a defense of positions around the villages of Voronovo, Kelevo, and Sias, following the Soviet capture of Krasnoye Selo the previous night. Despite destroying 11 enemy armoured vehicles on January 22nd alone, the position collapsed entirely within 4 days, forcing the entire German army group north to begin a general withdrawal toward the port of Narva, roughly midway between Tallinn and Leningrad on the southern coast of the Gulf of Finland. It was this retreat, this collapse of the northern front that Hitler had once hoped might hold indefinitely, that set the stage for the desperate months of fighting at Narva described earlier, the very campaign in which Carius earned his Knight's Cross. By the 3rd week of July 1944, the situation east of Daugavpils had become desperate. On July 16th, Kampfgruppe Carius, the small battle group that had effectively formed around his company, cleared up an enemy penetration south of the town of Turmantus. On July 19th, Carius received a chilling report. Soviet forces had broken through the German lines northeast of Daugavpils with somewhere between 90 and 100 tanks, an overwhelming mass of armour against which his own handful of Tigers seemed almost pitifully inadequate. The following day, July 20th, Carius reached the supply zone near a village called Narva, where he briefly encountered fellow Tiger ace Johannes Bölter, another highly decorated commander of the 502nd Battalion, and the two men exchanged a few words before returning to their respective duties. Neither of them could have known that within 48 hours the name of that small, unremarkable village would become permanently attached to one of the most celebrated and most fiercely disputed tank engagements of the entire Second World War, an engagement that would cement Otto Carius's reputation as one of the greatest panzer aces Germany ever produced, and that historians would still be picking apart, argument by argument, source by source, more than 80 years later. July 22nd, 1944 began, for Otto Carius, the way so many days had begun that summer, with chaos and confusion pouring in from every direction. As Carius and Kirscher drove ahead of their company in the Kübelwagen to reconnoiter the situation near Narva, what they encountered on the roads was not an organized front line, but a mob of panicked German troops fleeing before the Soviet onslaught. Trucks, wheeled vehicles, motorcycles, everything and everybody, in Carius's own later description, was heading toward Daugavpils, loaded down with men and equipment, flowing like a river swollen by a sudden rainstorm. No one could be persuaded to stop and explain what was happening. It was only when Carius and Kirscher encountered a terrified corporal running along a ditch who told them breathlessly that Russian tanks were already in the next village, that the scale of the crisis began to come into focus. The corporal climbed into the Kübelwagen, and the three men drove further forward to see for themselves. What they found from a ridge overlooking the village was sobering. The road descended from their position down into Narva, roughly a kilometre below, and through his binoculars, Carius could make out two Soviet T-34 tanks near the nearer entrance to the village, with more armour visible entering from the north. A motorcycle, carrying a Soviet-side prisoner or a fleeing German lieutenant, accounts vary, sped past, and it became clear that an entire German assault gun battalion had been encircled somewhere north of the village, its attempts to break out having already cost it 7 of its vehicles. Narva, in other words, was not merely occupied by scattered Soviet reconnaissance elements. It was held by a substantial force, likely the advance guard of a full Soviet tank brigade, possibly numbering close to 20 armoured vehicles, including some of the new and formidably armoured IS-2 heavy tanks that the Red Army had only recently begun fielding, machines that were, on paper, more than a match for even a Tiger in a head-on duel. Carius returned to his company and laid out the situation to his men. He had 8 Tigers under his command, a substantial force by the standards of a war in which entire panzer divisions sometimes fielded fewer operational tanks than that. But the terrain around Narva offered only a single, narrow, unimproved road leading into the village, and Carius understood immediately that sending his entire company down that bottleneck at once would expose his tanks to concentrated fire, with no room to manoeuvre or support one another effectively. Rather than risk his whole force in a headlong charge, he made a decision that would come to define his reputation as a tactician, rather than simply a marksman. He would attack with just 2 Tigers, his own and that of his close friend Albert Kirscher, while the remaining 6 tanks held back in reserve, ready to exploit whatever opening the initial assault created. Speed, surprise, and the devastating accuracy of the 88mm gun at close range would have to substitute for numbers. What happened next unfolded, by Carius's own account, in his memoir Tigers in the Mud, in less than 20 minutes. Carius and Kirscher drove their 2 Tigers directly into the village, catching the Soviet tank crews completely by surprise. The narrow streets of Narva became a killing ground, with the 2 German tanks engaging Soviet armour at ranges sometimes as short as a few dozen yards, well inside the distance at which the Tiger's frontal armour was essentially immune to return fire from a T-34's main gun, though considerably more vulnerable to the newer, more powerful guns mounted on the IS-2. Carius radioed back to his battalion commander that he had personally destroyed 17 so-called Stalins and 5 T-34s, an extraordinary tally for a single engagement involving only 2 tanks and one that would become, in the decades that followed, perhaps the single most scrutinised claim in the entire historiography of German tank warfare on the Eastern Front. According to Carius's own telling, not a single German tank was lost in the fighting inside the village, though 2 Tigers were rendered temporarily inoperable by anti-tank gun and tank cannon hits, and remarkably, by his account, there were no German personnel losses at all. But how much of this account can historians actually verify? This is where the story of Narva becomes genuinely fascinating, not merely as a tale of battlefield heroism, but as a case study in the difficulty of reconstructing exact truth from the fog of war, decades after the fact. The after-action report filed by Major Heinrich Schwaner, the battalion commander, and later reproduced within Carius's own memoir, credits the second company with destroying 17 tanks at Narva in total, of which 10 were attributed specifically to Carius's own Tiger and 4 to Kirscher's, with the remaining 3 credited to a nearby German assault gun unit that was also engaged in the fighting. Crucially, Schwaner's contemporary report describes the majority of the destroyed vehicles as T-34s, not the more formidable IS-2 heavy tanks that Carius's own later account emphasised so dramatically. Soviet archival records for the 5th Tank Corps, examined by historians in the decades since, suggest a similar overall figure somewhere in the range of 15 tanks lost near Narva that day, a mixture of T-34s and IS-2s, though Soviet accounts attribute a portion of these losses to artillery and air attacks rather than to Carius's Tigers alone. In other words, the essential core of the story, that Carius and Kershaw led a daring, badly outnumbered charge into a Soviet-held village and inflicted a lopsided defeat on the attacking force, appears to be corroborated by evidence from both sides. But the more embellished elements of Carius's later telling, the specific composition of the destroyed force, the higher casualty figures, and above all the claim of a follow-on engagement, would prove far more difficult for historians to substantiate. That follow-on engagement, as Carius described it in his memoir, took place later the same afternoon. After clearing Narva, his company advanced roughly 4 kilometers east to the village of Barsuki, where Carius and Kershaw, again riding ahead in their Kubelwagen, discovered fresh tank tracks belonging to the Soviet 1st Tank Brigade. Believing that the rest of the brigade, unaware of the disaster that had just befallen its advance guard at Narva, would soon come rolling down the same road, Carius organized an ambush. 6 of his Tigers forded a muddy creek and took up hidden positions behind a rise in the ground, their 88mm guns trained on roughly 2 miles of visible roadway, while 2 tanks that had become stuck attempting the crossing were left behind. According to Carius's account, when the main body of the Soviet brigade finally appeared, advancing without proper reconnaissance and completely unaware of the trap awaiting them, his Tigers opened fire and destroyed the entire column, a staggering 28 tanks in what would have been one of the most one-sided armoured ambushes of the entire war. This second engagement, however, is precisely the part of the Narva story that later historians have treated with the greatest skepticism. No German unit records beyond Carius's own personal recollection appear to corroborate an ambush of this scale east of Barsuki, and no Soviet tank unit operating in the area at the time seems to have recorded losing a formation of that size in a single engagement on that date. Some historians examining Soviet unit logs have concluded that this second, larger battle, as described in Tigers in the Mud, may represent a conflation or exaggeration of a smaller, separate engagement that did occur nearby, in which German forces claimed a far more modest handful of Soviet tanks destroyed. Was Carius simply mistaken, his memory blurred by the chaos, adrenaline, and trauma of continuous combat by the time he sat down years later to write his memoirs? Or did he, consciously or not, allow the story to grow in the retelling, the way so many battlefield accounts on every side of every war tend to grow with each passing year? Carius himself, in a later interview conducted long after the publication of his book, seemed to acknowledge the murkiness of exact tallies, revising his own personal claim of over 150 destroyed tanks down to a figure closer to 100 or even fewer, and explaining candidly that he had never personally kept a precise count, relying instead on the collective assessments of his crew and fellow officers, tallies that often included probable kills, shared credit between multiple tanks firing at the same target, and vehicles that were merely disabled rather than permanently destroyed. This is worth dwelling on for a moment because it says something important about how history itself gets made. Carius was not a propagandist sitting behind a desk inventing tales of heroism from thin air. He was a genuine combat veteran who fought in dozens of documented engagements, who bled for his country on multiple occasions, and whose Knight's Cross and subsequent Oak Leaves were awarded based on verified combat successes assessed by his own chain of command at the time, not decades later based on his memoir alone. But the specific, colourful, almost cinematic details of his most famous individual actions, the precise tank counts, the exact composition of enemy forces, the scale of the ambush east of Barsuki, these are exactly the kinds of details that tend to become embellished, whether through faulty memory, wartime propaganda incentives, or simply the natural human tendency to tell a better story with each retelling. Modern historians researching the Eastern Front increasingly cross-reference German after-action reports against surviving Soviet unit records precisely because memoirs written years or decades after the fact, however sincere, are simply not reliable as standalone historical sources. Carius's case has become something of a textbook example of this broader historiographical challenge, a reminder that even the most celebrated and thoroughly documented tank aces of the Second World War left behind stories that blend genuine, verifiable heroism with elements that simply cannot survive close scrutiny. Whatever the exact final tally, there is no dispute about the immediate tactical consequence of the fighting at Narva. By clearing the village and blunting the advance of the Soviet 5th Tank Corps, Carius's company had prevented, at least temporarily, a Soviet breakthrough toward Daugavpils, buying crucial time for German forces to establish a more coherent defensive line in the sector. For this action, Carius would be awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross, one of Nazi Germany's rarer and more prestigious decorations, recognition that came astonishingly fast, within days rather than months, a testament to just how significant his superiors judged the engagement to have been, regardless of the precise final count of destroyed Soviet tanks. But before that decoration could even be formally announced, Carius's war was about to take the most dramatic and nearly fatal turn of his entire career, one that had nothing to do with tank versus tank combat at all, and everything to do with the simple, terrifying vulnerability of a man on foot, caught in the open, far from the protection of his own armour. The date was July 24th, 1944, just 2 days after the fighting at Narva. True to the reconnaissance habits that had served him so well throughout the previous weeks, Carius set out ahead of his company on a motorcycle with sidecar, accompanied by his driver, to scout the road toward Daugavpils in advance of his tanks, a routine he had performed dozens of times before, without serious incident. This time his luck ran out. No sooner had Carius dismounted from the motorcycle than he and his driver were ambushed by Soviet troops lying in wait along the roadside. Carius was hit almost immediately, shot through the thigh, and as he went down, the Russians continued firing, striking him again in the arm, and then 4 more times in the back as he lay exposed on the open ground. It was, by any reasonable measure, a mortal situation. A decorated Tiger commander, a man who had survived dozens of tank battles protected by inches of hardened steel armour, now lay bleeding on a dirt road in Latvia with 7 bullet wounds, utterly defenceless, as enemy soldiers closed in around him. What happened in the next few moments would become, alongside the battle for Narva itself, one of the defining stories of Carius's entire wartime career, an episode so dramatic that it reads, even in the sober language of military history, almost like something out of an action film. 3 Soviet soldiers reached the wounded Carius, and one of them, a Russian officer, drew his pistol and aimed it directly at Carius's head, preparing to finish him off at point-blank range. In that instant, as the trigger was pulled, Carius, with his one still functioning arm, managed to turn his head, and the bullet meant to kill him instead struck him through the neck, missing anything immediately fatal by what can only be described as the narrowest possible margin. He survived, conscious and, by his own later account, feeling almost no pain in the overwhelming rush of adrenaline and shock flooding through his body. And then, just as the Soviet soldiers prepared to finish what they had started, salvation arrived in the form of the very machines Carius had spent the last year mastering. The Tiger tanks of his own company, alerted to the ambush, came thundering onto the scene in a rescue that even Carius himself would later describe in almost cinematic terms, scattering the Soviet troops and saving his life with only seconds to spare. His crew and comrades bandaged his wounds as best they could in the field, using, in one especially vivid detail that has been passed down through multiple historical accounts, Carius's own elastic suspenders to help stop the bleeding from his leg. He was lifted onto the back of one of the surviving Tigers and clung to the turret as the tank rumbled back toward friendly lines, and even in this desperate state, with barely one working limb, Carius reportedly stood up when the Russians opened fire again, shouting directions to the tank commander about the source of the incoming fire before his foot became painfully jammed between the rotating turret and the hull. It was an almost unbelievable display of presence of mind from a man who, by any ordinary measure, should have been unconscious or already dead. He was rushed to a field hospital, where, against considerable odds, he made what doctors would describe as a full recovery. In a strange twist of bureaucratic timing, Carius had technically been running the 2nd Company of the 502nd Battalion, unofficially for some time, but it was on this very day, the day he was shot 7 times and nearly executed on the roadside outside Daugavpils, that he was officially confirmed as company commander, a promotion earned, quite literally, in blood. The wounded Carius could not be evacuated by rail, since Soviet advances had already cut the direct rail connections back toward Germany. So instead, he was loaded onto a ship at Tallinn, in Estonia, on July 25, 1944, for the journey home. It was aboard that ship, in the middle of the Baltic Sea, still recovering from wounds that would have killed most men several times over, that Carius received word of his second great decoration of the war. The oak leaves to his Knight's Cross, awarded on July 27, 1944, in formal recognition of the leadership he had shown during the fighting in defence of the Daugavpils sector, including, but not limited, to the engagement at Narva. He arrived in Germany at the port of Swinemünde on August 1, 1944, beginning what would become a long convalescence, first in military hospitals and later in a more extended recovery period, away from the front entirely. For a man not yet 23 years old, Carius had already survived nearly total physical devastation. A bullet through the thigh, another through the arm, 4 rounds in the back and 1 through the neck, in addition to the earlier wounds he had sustained during the Barbarossa campaign back in 1941. It is worth pausing here to ask a question that Carius himself must have asked in the long, painful weeks of recovery that followed. How many more times could his luck possibly hold? The answer, remarkably, was at least once more. While Carius convalesced in Germany through the late summer and autumn of 1944, the war he had left behind continued its catastrophic collapse. The 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion, the unit he had helped make famous, continued to be fed into what Carius and his fellow veterans would later describe as the Soviet maelstrom, grinding attritional combat that consumed tanks and crews at a rate the German war economy could no longer sustain. On July 25th, just one day after Carius's own near-fatal wounding, his comrade Neinstedt returned to the fighting at Narva in support of a German grenadier regiment attempting to retake the village, and though wounded himself, remained with his company long enough to destroy 2 more Soviet tanks and 3 anti-tank guns before the battle ended. On the same day, another company commander, Eichhorn, led a counterattack toward the village of Ausgliani and unexpectedly ran into a force of 16 Soviet Stalin tanks and newer T-43 models. In a ferocious close-range engagement fought at distances under 300 yards, Eichhorn's Tigers destroyed all 16 enemy tanks without losing a single vehicle of their own, an almost unbelievable feat that, whatever the precise historiographical debates about individual tank counts throughout this campaign, underscores just how lethal the Tiger could be in the right hands and the right terrain, even as the broader strategic situation for Germany continued to deteriorate on every front. By the time Carius had recovered enough to consider a return to active duty, the character of the war had changed dramatically. The Eastern Front, where he had built his entire reputation, was now a landscape of continuous retreat as Soviet forces pushed inexorably westward through Poland and into the borders of East Prussia itself. Germany's military leadership, meanwhile, was scrambling to field new weapons in a desperate attempt to blunt the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies on both fronts. One of these new weapons was the Jag Tiger, an enormous, heavily armoured tank destroyer built on a lengthened Tiger II chassis and armed with an even more powerful 128mm gun. A weapon theoretically capable of destroying any Allied tank in existence at ranges exceeding 2 miles. At 72 tons, the Jag Tiger was the heaviest armoured fighting vehicle to see service in the entire war, and on paper it represented the ultimate expression of German heavy armour doctrine. A fortress on tracks, able to sit at extreme range and pick off enemy tanks before they could even bring their own guns to bear. In practice, as Carius would soon discover firsthand, the Jag Tiger was a deeply flawed weapon. Early in 1945, following his recovery, Carius was assigned as commander of a company within the newly formed 512th Heavy Anti-Tank Battalion, or Schwer. Panzerjägerabteilung 512, one of the small number of units equipped with this new vehicle. He was, by his own later account, distinctly unimpressed. The Jag Tiger was extremely slow, hampered by poor manoeuvrability and a chronically underpowered transmission that struggled to cope with the vehicle's enormous weight, and its transmission and running gear proved prone to breakdown even by the demanding standards of German heavy armour, which had never been famous for mechanical reliability in the first place. As an assault gun-style vehicle, the Jag Tiger also lacked a rotating turret, meaning that engaging targets outside its narrow forward firing arc required the entire vehicle to be repositioned, a serious tactical limitation for a machine that size and one that Carius, an officer who had built his entire combat philosophy around flexibility and careful positioning, found particularly frustrating. He would later write candidly about his disappointment with the vehicle, a refreshingly honest assessment from a man who had every professional and personal incentive to simply celebrate whatever new German superweapon he happened to be assigned. The company Carius commanded was called into action in March 1945 without having completed its training, a measure of just how desperate the German military situation had become by that point in the war, with the Reich's borders shrinking on all sides and replacement crews rushed to the front with only the barest minimum of preparation. On March 8, 1945, his second company was directed to the front lines near Siegburg, a town on the eastern bank of the Rhine, tasked with helping to defend the river against advancing American and British forces. It was, in every sense, a different war from the one Carius had fought in the east. Gone were the vast open distances of the Russian steppe and the dense forests around Narva. In their place was the increasingly claustrophobic, collapsing geography of Western Germany itself, as Allied armies converged from multiple directions on the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, threatening to encircle and destroy the substantial German forces still fighting there. By early April 1945, Carius's unit had become trapped within what became known as the Ruhr Pocket, or Ruhrkessel, a massive encirclement in which some 300,000 German troops, along with dozens of generals, were surrounded by advancing American forces and slowly compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter with no realistic hope of relief or escape. Carius took part in the fighting around Friedrich Wilhelm Höhe near the Bismarck Tower in the town of Unna, part of the final futile German effort to hold together a defensive line that everyone involved, from the lowest private to the most senior general, understood to be collapsing. On April 15, 1945, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlin, the officer to whom Carius's unit was subordinated within the pocket, a veteran commander who had fought in North Africa alongside Rommel before commanding the elite Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy, gave the order that effectively ended organized German resistance in the sector. All combat operations were to cease. The following day, in the district of Iserlohn, Otto Carius, the young man once rejected from military service for being underweight, the tank commander who had survived 7 bullet wounds in a single ambush on the road to Daugavpils, the officer who had destroyed enemy tank after enemy tank across 2 years of continuous combat on 2 different fronts, was taken prisoner by the United States Army just 3 weeks before the war in Europe would finally, formally, come to an end. It is worth taking a moment here to place Otto Carius alongside the other great panzer aces of the Second World War, men whose names have become almost as legendary as his own within the specialized world of armored warfare history. Michael Wittmann, perhaps the single most famous Tiger commander of the entire war, achieved spectacular success in Normandy in the summer of 1944, destroying an entire column of British armour in a matter of minutes near Villers-Bocage. Before being killed in action later that same summer, his tank obliterated in circumstances that remain debated by historians to this day. Kurt Knispel, credited by some accounts with the highest confirmed tank kill total of any tank gunner or commander in history, fought with a reckless, almost fatalistic aggression throughout the war before. Finally being killed in April 1945, just days before the German surrender, one of the last men to die in a conflict he had fought from nearly its opening months. Carius, by contrast, survived. Where Wittmann died in a blaze of glory that cemented his legend but foreclosed any future, and where Knispel's death came with the war already effectively lost, Carius lived through wound after wound, engagement after engagement, and emerged from the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. Not as a martyr to the cause, but as a survivor, a distinction that would shape the rest of his life in ways that neither Wittmann nor Knispel would ever have the chance to experience. There is something worth reflecting on in this contrast. The German propaganda machine of the Second World War, much like propaganda machines throughout history, tended to prize dramatic, often fatal heroism. The kind of story that could be turned into a newsreel or a magazine profile celebrating sacrifice for the fatherland. Carius's survival, in a strange way, denied him that particular kind of mythologizing during the war itself, even as his actual combat record, when scrutinized by later historians, arguably placed him among the most tactically skilled and consistently effective tank commanders that any army fielded during the entire conflict. He did not seek out death in the way that some of his more famous contemporaries seemed to, whether consciously or not. He fought carefully, used terrain and surprise rather than brute force whenever possible, relied on reconnaissance before committing his forces, and above all valued the survival of his own men and machines over the kind of headline-grabbing, all-or-nothing charges that made for more dramatic wartime propaganda, but that also tended to get tank crews killed. It is perhaps fitting, then, that the man who fought this way should be the one who lived to walk away from the war entirely, bullet wounds and all. But what exactly awaited a survivor of Otto Carius's particular kind, a twice-decorated Knight's Cross holder with oak leaves, a man whose combat record placed him among the very elite of Nazi Germany's military honour system in the ruins of a defeated and occupied country? This was the question hanging over Carius and over hundreds of thousands of other former German soldiers as American guards processed him into captivity in the district of Iserlohn in mid-April 1945. The Third Reich he had fought for, the regime whose highest military decorations adorned his uniform, was collapsing with astonishing speed. Hitler would be dead within 2 weeks by his own hand in a bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. The unconditional surrender of all German forces would follow shortly after on May 8, 1945, bringing to a close a war that had cost the lives of tens of millions of people across Europe, the Soviet Union, and beyond, a staggering human catastrophe of a scale that dwarfed even the most dramatic individual tank battles that men like Carius had fought and, in some cases, embellished in their later retellings. For Carius personally, captivity was, in the grand scheme of things, relatively brief and relatively humane, a fact that stood in sharp contrast to the fate that awaited many of his former comrades who had fought and been captured on the Eastern Front, where Soviet treatment of German prisoners of war was, in innumerable documented cases, brutal, and where survival rates in Soviet captivity, particularly for the war's first several years, were grimly low. Carius, having ended his war as a prisoner of the United States Army rather than the Red Army, would be released from captivity on May 21, 1945, just over a month after his capture, a mere 13 days after Germany's formal surrender. He walked out of an American prisoner of war enclosure a free man, but a free man in a country that had been utterly devastated. Its cities reduced to rubble by years of Allied bombing, its economy shattered, its political structures dismantled, and its people forced to reckon, in the years that followed, with the full and horrifying scope of the crimes that had been committed in their name by the regime Carius and millions of others had served, fought for, and in his own case, been decorated by, at the very highest level. The question now was not how many more Soviet tanks Otto Carius could destroy, but what an unemployed 23-year-old former tank commander, trained for nothing but war, was supposed to do with the rest of his life in a Germany that had lost everything. It is worth pausing, before leaving the Narva campaign behind entirely, to appreciate just how unusual and how genuinely international the defence of that small Estonian city had become by the spring of 1944, a detail that adds important context to the battles Carius fought there. The German forces holding the Narva front were not simply Wehrmacht units like Carius's own Tiger Company. They fought alongside the SS volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, itself composed largely of Scandinavian and Dutch volunteers who had chosen, for reasons ranging from genuine ideological conviction to anti-communism to simple opportunism, to fight in German uniform against the Soviet Union. Estonian conscripts and volunteers, hoping desperately to prevent the return of Soviet occupation to their homeland after the brutal deportations and repression they had already experienced under Soviet rule in 1940 and 1941, made up a substantial portion of the defending forces as well, fighting with a level of motivation and local knowledge of the terrain that German commanders came to value highly. This diverse, multinational character of the Narva defence, sometimes described by historians as the Battle of the European SS, reflected the increasingly desperate and improvised nature of German military planning by 1944, as the Wehrmacht leaned ever more heavily on foreign volunteers and conscripts to fill the gaps left by catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, gaps that German manpower alone could no longer fill. Carius, as a regular Wehrmacht officer commanding conventional Tiger tanks, worked in close tactical coordination with these SS and foreign volunteer formations throughout the Narva campaign, a routine feature of frontline cooperation that, as noted earlier, complicates any attempt to draw a completely clean line between the ordinary German army and the more explicitly ideological and criminal apparatus of the SS. This was simply how the war was fought in that sector. Infantry from Nordland or from Estonian battalions would identify and pin down Soviet infantry and anti-tank positions, while Carius's Tigers, held in reserve and committed at the critical moment, would deal with any Soviet armour that appeared. A combined arms partnership that, whatever its underlying political complexities, proved remarkably effective at holding the Narva line for months against a Soviet force that vastly outnumbered the defenders in both manpower and equipment. The bridgehead ultimately held until the last days of July 1944, with the city of Narva itself finally falling on July 26th, just 2 days after Carius's own near-fatal wounding on the road outside Daugavpils, a stark illustration of how quickly the entire northern sector of the front was collapsing, even as individual engagements like Malinova continued to produce lopsided tactical successes for the retreating Germans. The story of the Narva campaign, in other words, offers a useful microcosm of the broader German war effort by 1944. Individual units and individual commanders, Carius very much among them, continuing to fight with real skill and real effectiveness at the tactical level, inflicting genuinely disproportionate losses on their Soviet opponents in engagement after engagement, while the overall strategic picture continued to deteriorate with a momentum that no amount of individual battlefield brilliance could reverse. This is a pattern that would repeat itself again and again across the German military in the war's final 2 years, from the panzer divisions fighting brilliant but ultimately futile defensive actions in Normandy after D-Day, to the desperate scratch formations thrown together to slow the Soviet advance through Poland in early 1945, to Carius's own final months of service with the Jagdtiger in the collapsing Ruhr pocket. Tactical excellence, however genuine and however well documented, was simply no longer sufficient to alter a strategic trajectory that had been effectively decided by the material and manpower imbalances that had become undeniable by the second half of 1943, long before most individual soldiers on the ground, Carius included, could have fully grasped just how hopeless Germany's overall position had already become. When Otto Carius walked free from American captivity on May 21, 1945, he stepped into a world that had almost nothing in common with the one he had left behind 5 years earlier as an eager, underweight recruit trying desperately to prove the army wrong about his fitness for service. Germany in the summer of 1945 was a landscape of ruins. Its major cities had been flattened by years of relentless Allied bombing. Its economy had effectively ceased to function in any conventional sense, with a barter system replacing formal currency in many areas. Millions of its former soldiers were streaming home or attempting to, many of them maimed, traumatized, or simply lost, uncertain what a civilian life could possibly look like after years of nothing but combat. And hanging over the entire nation was the slowly emerging, increasingly undeniable weight of what the Nazi regime had actually done. The full scope of the Holocaust and the countless other atrocities committed across occupied Europe, revelations that would force an entire generation of Germans, including decorated veterans like Carius, to grapple with questions of complicity, knowledge, and moral responsibility that had no easy answers. For a man like Carius, whose entire adult life to that point had consisted of training for and then executing armoured warfare, the question of what came next was genuinely open. He was 23 years old, in reasonably good health despite the extraordinary catalogue of wounds he had accumulated over 4 years of combat, and he possessed skills that were, in the context of a demilitarised, occupied Germany, almost entirely useless. There would be no more Tigers to command, no more Iron Crosses to earn, no army at all for the foreseeable future, since the Allied occupying powers had dissolved the Wehrmacht in its entirety as part of the broader process of denazification and demilitarization that defined the early post-war years. Carius, like hundreds of thousands of other former officers and soldiers, had to reinvent himself from nothing. He chose pharmacy. It is worth pausing on this choice because on its surface it seems almost jarringly incongruous. A man who had spent years commanding some of the most powerful and destructive weapons of his era, deciding to spend the rest of his life dispensing medicine to treat coughs, infections, and minor ailments in a small German village. But in another sense, the choice makes a certain kind of sense. Pharmacy was a stable, respected, apolitical profession, one that offered a clear and structured path forward at a time when so much else about German society had been thrown into chaos and uncertainty. It required discipline, precision, and attention to detail, qualities that Carius had spent years honing in an entirely different context, and it offered the prospect of a quiet, useful, and comfortably middle-class life, a sharp contrast to the violence and destruction that had defined the previous half-decade of his existence. Carius completed a preliminary internship and preparatory examination as a pharmacist's assistant in the years immediately following the war, and then, in 1948, enrolled to study pharmacy formally at the University of Freiburg in Breisgau in the far southwest of Germany, continuing his studies there through 1951. Some accounts place part of his academic training at Heidelberg University as well, one of Germany's oldest and most prestigious institutions, a fitting environment for a man determined to rebuild his life through rigorous, methodical study. From 1952 onward, Carius worked as a salaried pharmacist, gaining practical professional experience in someone else's establishment before he was ready to strike out fully on his own. That opportunity came in 1956 when Carius took over an existing pharmacy called the Hirsch Apotheke, or Stag Pharmacy, in the small village of Hirschweiler-Pettersheim, located in the Rhineland-Palatinate region of Western Germany, not far from where he had grown up. He renamed the establishment almost immediately. From that year forward, it would be known as the Tiger Apotheke, the Tiger Pharmacy, a direct and deeply personal tribute to the tank that had defined the most consequential years of his young life. It is a small but telling detail that speaks volumes about how Carius understood his own history. He did not attempt to hide or bury his wartime past, as many former German soldiers, particularly those who had served in more overtly criminal capacities, understandably chose to do in the difficult, morally fraught atmosphere of post-war Germany. Instead, he named his new civilian enterprise directly after the machine with which his combat legacy was most closely associated, a gesture that would have been unthinkable for a former SS concentration camp guard or a senior Nazi party functionary, but that carried a different, more complicated resonance for a professional soldier whose actual combat record, whatever its embellishments, consisted overwhelmingly of tank versus tank engagements against the Red Army, rather than participation in the regime's campaign of genocide and atrocity. Carius ran the Tiger Apotheke for the next 55 years, an almost unimaginably long tenure that saw him transform from a 23-year-old former lieutenant with 7 bullet wounds and a chest full of medals into a beloved, respected fixture of small-town German life. The kind of local pharmacist whose customers came to know not just for his professional expertise, but for his personal history, his quiet demeanor, and, as the decades passed and his wartime fame slowly spread through military history circles around the world, his status as something of a living legend among enthusiasts of armoured warfare. He would not finally retire from the pharmacy until 2011, at the remarkable age of 89, having spent well over half a century behind the same counter in the same small village. A stability and continuity that stands in the sharpest possible contrast to the chaotic, violent, constantly shifting years of his military service. It was in 1960, while still relatively early in his career as a civilian pharmacist, that Carius published the book that would ultimately make him famous far beyond the borders of Germany and far beyond the relatively narrow circle of former Wehrmacht veterans and military history enthusiasts who might otherwise have been the primary audience for such a memoir. Tigers in the Mud, originally published in German, told the story of his wartime service in vivid, detailed first-person prose, recounting the engagements at Narva, the dramatic battle at Malinova, the near-fatal ambush outside Daugavpils, and his later service with the Jagdtiger in the final collapse of the Western Front. The book was first published by the Buchkameradschaft Scharnhorst through the Vauwinkel Publishing House, and it proved successful enough to go through 4 subsequent editions over the following decades, eventually being self-published and distributed directly by Carius himself through his own pharmacy. A fittingly hands-on approach for a man who seemed to prefer doing things his own way on his own terms, whether commanding a Tiger tank or running a small business. Over the years, the book would eventually be published in 6 editions across 17 different languages, making it, by any reasonable measure, one of the most successful and widely read individual memoirs to emerge from the German side of the Second World War, a genuinely global publishing phenomenon that few, if any, other tank commanders from either side of the conflict could match. Why did Tigers in the Mud resonate so powerfully with readers, decades after the events it described, in countries that Carius himself had once fought against, or that had no direct connection to the war at all? Part of the answer lies simply in the quality and immediacy of the storytelling itself. Carius wrote, or at least came across in translation, as a natural narrator, someone with a keen eye for the small, human details that make combat narratives feel real rather than abstract. The exhaustion, the black humour among crewmen facing death on a daily basis, the strange intimacy of 5 men sharing a cramped steel compartment for months at a time, the sudden terrifying transitions from boredom to violence and back again that defined so much of frontline existence. Part of the answer also lies in timing and audience. As the decades passed after 1945, a growing community of military history enthusiasts, wargamers, and amateur historians developed a deep, almost obsessive fascination with German armoured warfare specifically. Drawn by the technical sophistication of vehicles like the Tiger, the tactical complexity of the Eastern Front campaigns, and the genuinely compelling human stories of the men who fought inside these machines. Carius's memoir, with its combination of technical detail, dramatic combat narrative, and an author who was, by all accounts, personally accessible and willing to correspond with fans and historians well into his old age, became something close to a foundational text within that community, frequently cited, referenced, and adapted in the decades that followed. Among the more unexpected chapters in the afterlife of Tigers in the Mud was its adaptation into a manga, a genre of Japanese comic art by none other than Hayao Miyazaki, the legendary animator and filmmaker later celebrated worldwide as the creative force behind Studio Ghibli and films such as Spirited Away and My Neighbor Totoro. Long before he became one of the most acclaimed filmmakers in the world, Miyazaki had a deep personal fascination with military hardware, particularly aircraft and armoured vehicles, an interest that ran alongside and sometimes intersected with his more famous work in animated fantasy. Miyazaki created a watercolour manga adaptation of Carius's memoir, titled in translation something close to Tigers Covered with Mud, which was serialized in the Japanese magazine Model Graphics between December 1998 and May 1999. Originally conceived as a 3-episode story, the adaptation proved substantial enough in scope that it was ultimately expanded to 6 episodes, a testament to just how much material and detail Carius's original memoir contained, and a striking, almost surreal illustration of how far and wide the story of this one small-town German pharmacist's wartime experiences had travelled by the end of the 20th century. The reach of Carius's legend extended into other unexpected corners of popular culture as well. Model manufacturers produced detailed replicas of his personal Tiger, marked with its distinctive turret number 217, as well as later kits depicting his Jag Tiger from the final months of the war. The popular online multiplayer game World of Tanks, which allows players to command historically inspired armoured vehicles against one another, named a specific gunnery achievement after him, recognizing outstanding accuracy and effectiveness in combat. A fitting digital age tribute to a man whose wartime reputation rested so heavily on precision marksmanship under pressure. The tabletop miniature wargame Flames of War incorporated Carius as a named special character, allowing tabletop generals to command virtual Tiger units modelled after his own historical exploits, complete with special rules reflecting his documented tactical skill. It is a strange kind of immortality, the sort that few ordinary combat veterans from any war ever achieve. One built not through continued public prominence or political engagement in the post-war decades, since Carius, unlike some other former Wehrmacht officers, largely avoided involvement in veterans' political organizations or nationalist movements, but simply through the enduring power of a well-told war story and the passionate, detail-obsessed subculture of military history, enthusiasts who kept his name alive across generations and continents. None of this, however, should obscure the more uncomfortable questions that inevitably surround any celebrated figure from Nazi Germany's military. However genuinely skilled or however narrowly his own documented actions were confined to conventional tank versus tank combat, rather than the regime's broader crimes. Carius fought for a regime responsible for the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of other victims across occupied Europe, a regime whose war of aggression in the East was explicitly conceived, from its very inception, as a war of racial extermination and enslavement, not merely a conventional military campaign in the manner of the fighting in France or North Africa. The German army in the east operated in close coordination with the SS Einsatzgruppen and other units carrying out mass killings behind the front lines. And while there is no evidence in the extensive documentation of Carius's own combat career that he personally participated in or was directly responsible for war crimes or atrocities against civilians, the broader institutional context in which he served cannot simply be separated out or ignored when assessing his legacy. His own units fought alongside Waffen-SS formations at Narva, cooperating closely with SS commanders and SS divisions as a matter of routine operational necessity. A reminder that the line between conventional Wehrmacht service and the broader apparatus of Nazi terror was, in practice, often far blurrier than post-war narratives of a supposedly clean Wehrmacht, untainted by the crimes of the SS and the party, would like to suggest. This tension between celebrating genuine tactical skill and battlefield courage on one hand, and reckoning honestly with the criminal nature of the cause those skills served on the other, runs through the entire post-war historiography of the German armed forces, and Carius's case sits squarely within it. For decades after 1945, a narrative took hold, both within West Germany and among many military history enthusiasts internationally, that drew a sharp moral distinction between the regular Wehrmacht, portrayed as a professional fighting force engaged in more or less conventional combat, and the Waffen-SS and other explicitly Nazi party organizations, portrayed as the true perpetrators of the regime's worst crimes. This narrative, often referred to by historians as the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, offered a convenient framework within which former soldiers like Carius could be remembered and could remember themselves, primarily as brave, skilled professionals who had simply done their duty in a conventional war, rather than as participants, however peripheral, in a broader criminal enterprise. Since the 1990s, however, a substantial body of historical scholarship, including a widely discussed travelling exhibition in Germany examining the crimes of the Wehrmacht, has thoroughly dismantled this clean hands narrative, documenting in exhaustive detail the ways in which regular German army units, not just the SS, participated in atrocities against civilians, prisoners of war, and partisans across the occupied Soviet Union, and cooperated routinely and knowingly with the SS killing squads operating behind the front lines. This scholarship does not claim that every single German soldier personally committed war crimes, an obviously false and unhelpful generalization, but it does insist that the wartime German military as an institution was deeply, structurally implicated in the Nazi regime's campaign of racial extermination in the East, in ways that go far beyond the actions of a few rogue units or fanatical SS formations operating in isolation. Where does this leave an assessment of a figure like Otto Carius, a man whose own documented combat record consists overwhelmingly, as far as the historical evidence shows, of tank battles against Soviet armoured forces, but who served within this broader institutional and ideological context nonetheless, and whose units, as noted, fought in direct cooperation with SS formations at Narva as a matter of routine tactical necessity? There is no fully satisfying answer to this question, and viewers should be wary of anyone on either side of the debate who claims there is. What can be said with confidence is that Carius himself, in his later public statements and interviews, generally avoided the kind of unrepentant, ideologically charged nostalgia for the Nazi regime that characterized some other former German officers in the post-war decades. He presented himself consistently as a professional soldier who had fought for his country in a war he had not started and had limited power to influence at the policy level, a framing that is common among Wehrmacht veterans of his generation, and that carries a certain surface plausibility for a man who spent the war as a junior officer commanding tanks rather than as a senior figure shaping strategy or policy, but that also inevitably sidesteps the deeper and more uncomfortable questions about complicity, knowledge, and moral responsibility that historians have continued to grapple with in the decades since. Carius does not appear to have publicly and extensively reckoned, in the manner of some other former German soldiers who became outspoken critics of the Nazi past, with the full moral weight of the cause he had fought for, but neither did he glorify it or seek to rehabilitate it. He occupied, in this sense, a kind of ambiguous middle ground that characterizes the post-war lives of a great many ordinary Wehrmacht veterans, neither villain nor hero in any simple sense, a skilled and genuinely brave soldier who fought effectively for a regime whose fundamental cause was indefensible. What is easier to document and less morally fraught is the shape of Carius's actual civilian life in the decades following the war, a life that by all available accounts was quiet, stable, and largely defined by professional dedication and a close-knit circle of former wartime comrades, beginning in the mid-1950s, surviving members of the 2nd Company of the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion began organizing periodic reunions, gathering to reminisce, to grieve their fallen comrades, and to maintain the bonds forged in some of the most intense combat conditions imaginable. The first such gathering took place around 1954 in Holzkirchen, near Munich, and further reunions followed in subsequent years, including one at Seewaldchen on the shores of the Attersee in Austria. These gatherings continued for decades, a testament to just how powerfully the shared experience of Tiger tank combat on the Eastern Front had bound these men together, ties that clearly outlasted the war itself by more than half a century in some cases. Carius, by all accounts, remained a central figure in this veteran community throughout his long life, corresponding with fellow former soldiers, with historians researching the campaigns he had fought in, and eventually with a growing international audience of fans and researchers drawn to his story through his memoir and its many adaptations and spin-offs. As the decades passed and Carius aged from a young pharmacist into an elderly, widely respected figure in his small corner of the Rhineland-Palatinate, his fame paradoxically seemed only to grow rather than fade, driven largely by the enduring popularity of Tigers in the Mud among successive generations of military history readers and by the increasing accessibility through the internet and specialized publishing houses of detailed research into his individual engagements. He gave interviews to historians and documentary filmmakers well into his 80s and 90s, offering first-hand recollections of events that, by the early 21st century, an ever-dwindling number of surviving witnesses could still describe from direct personal experience. In these later interviews, Carius came across, by most accounts, as a sharp, articulate, and generally modest man, willing to discuss his wartime experiences in detail, but not inclined towards self-mythologizing bravado. And it was in one of these later interviews that he offered his own notably deflationary reassessment of his total tank kill count, revising the commonly cited figure of over 150 downwards to something closer to 100 or even fewer, a rare example of a celebrated wartime figure actively working to moderate his own legend rather than inflate it further, a detail that many historians and enthusiasts have pointed to as evidence of his fundamental honesty, whatever the uncertainties surrounding the specific tallies from individual engagements like Narva. Carius continued to run the Tiger Apotheke for an extraordinarily long time, well past the point at which most people in any profession would have considered retirement, finally stepping back from the pharmacy in 2011 at the age of 89 after 55 years behind the counter of the same small-town establishment. By that point, he had outlived nearly all of his wartime comrades, outlived the Cold War division of Germany that had followed the conflict he fought in, and lived to see a reunified German nation that bore almost no resemblance, politically, economically, or culturally, to the one he had grown up in during the 1920s and 1930s. He had watched the historiography of his own war evolve dramatically over the decades, from the simplified, often self-serving narratives of the immediate post-war period through the more rigorous, more morally searching scholarship of the later 20th and early 21st centuries. Scholarship that, as discussed, complicated the very framework within which men like himself had often been remembered and celebrated. Through all of it, Carius remained in Hirschweiler-Pettersheim, the small village where he had rebuilt his life from nothing after 1945. A fixture of local life whose extraordinary wartime history existed alongside, rather than overshadowing, his decades of quiet, useful service as the neighborhood pharmacist that generations of local residents had come to know and rely upon. Otto Carius died on January 24, 2015, in Hirschweiler-Pettersheim, the same small village where he had spent nearly 60 years of his civilian life at the age of 92. He was buried in the local cemetery, surrounded, according to accounts of his funeral, by his family and by many of those closest to him from both his wartime and civilian lives. A quiet, dignified end for a man whose youth had been defined by some of the most violent and dramatic combat of the entire Second World War. His death was noted in military history publications and news outlets around the world, a measure of just how far his fame had travelled from its origins in a series of tank battles fought across the marshes of Estonia and the villages of eastern Latvia more than 70 years earlier. Tributes poured in from the international community of historians, wargamers, and enthusiasts who had followed his story for decades, many of them noting not just his combat record, but the remarkable second act of his life, the decades of quiet civilian service that had followed his years as one of history's most celebrated tank commanders. Beyond the specific, sometimes contested details of individual engagements like Narva, what does the broader historical record actually tell us about the effectiveness of the Tiger tank and the units, like the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion that fielded it throughout the war? Across its entire operational history, the 502nd claimed an aggregate total approaching 1,400 enemy tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed, an almost staggering figure for a single battalion, though one that, like Carius's own individual tally, has to be understood within the context of the methodological challenges that plague all such wartime claim counting, including overlapping credit between multiple crews firing at the same target, unconfirmed kills that were later revised, and the inherent difficulty of verifying destruction amid the chaos of a fluid, rapidly changing front line. What is not seriously disputed, however, is that the Tiger, wherever it was deployed in sufficient numbers and used with tactical intelligence, imposed a genuinely disproportionate cost on the attacking Soviet forces it faced, forcing Red Army commanders to develop new tactics, new equipment, and new doctrine, specifically to counter its advantages in armor and firepower. The introduction of the Soviet IS-2 heavy tank itself, the very vehicle that Carius and his comrades battled at Narva, was in significant part a direct response to the battlefield dominance that German heavy tanks like the Tiger had demonstrated earlier in the war, a technological and doctrinal arms race playing out in real time across the killing fields of the Eastern Front. It is worth asking, too, what made Carius specifically stand out among the hundreds of German tank commanders who fought with Tigers over the course of the war, given that the vehicle itself, however formidable, was operated by thousands of crewmen across dozens of battalions, the vast majority of whom achieved far more modest or simply undocumented combat records. Part of the answer lies in simple survival. Many of the most successful early Tiger aces, men who might otherwise have gone on to compile combat records rivaling or exceeding Carius's own, were killed in action before the war's end, their stories cut short and their names remembered, if at all, only within specialized unit histories rather than in best-selling international memoirs. Carius's survival against genuinely extraordinary odds meant that he alone, among a relatively small group of similarly skilled and successful commanders, lived to write the book, to give the interviews, to correspond with historians and fans for decades, and to shape, in his own voice and on his own terms, how his story would ultimately be told and remembered. This is an important and often underappreciated dynamic in the broader historiography of military reputation. The men whose names become most famous are not always, and perhaps are not even usually, the objectively most skilled or most successful, but rather those who survived long enough and who possessed sufficient narrative skill and personal charisma to tell their own story before historians and popular audiences alike. There is also the simple matter of Carius's own personality and temperament, as reflected consistently across every source examined for this account, from wartime documentation through post-war interviews. He comes across again and again, not as a swaggering, self-glorifying war hero eager to inflate his own legend, but as a careful, somewhat understated professional, whether commanding a Tiger tank in combat or dispensing prescriptions behind a pharmacy counter in a small German village for 55 consecutive years. This consistency of character, this quiet, methodical, almost bureaucratic diligence, applied, with equal seriousness to both mortal combat and small-town pharmacy work, is perhaps the single most distinctive thread running through the entire arc of Otto Carius's remarkable life, and it goes a long way toward explaining why his story continues to resonate with readers and historians so many decades after the events themselves took place. He was, in the end, neither a monster nor an uncomplicated hero, but something far more human and far more difficult to categorize. a supremely skilled young soldier who fought a series of desperate, often brutal battles for a criminal regime he did not create and could not control, who survived against odds that should by any reasonable calculation have killed him many times over, and who then spent the far longer remainder of his life quietly, diligently serving the ordinary medical needs of his small community. A life that, taken as a whole, defies easy summary or simple moral judgment. Before moving on to the final chapter of this story, it is worth pausing to consider one more question that inevitably arises when examining any celebrated wartime memoir. What do we actually owe to the historical record when a source as influential and as widely read as Tigers in the Mud contains claims that cannot be fully verified or that appear, on close examination, to have been exaggerated? The honest answer, and one that responsible historians have increasingly embraced in recent decades, is that we owe the historical record rigour rather than either uncritical acceptance or wholesale dismissal. Carius's memoir remains an invaluable primary source for understanding the texture, the rhythm, and the human experience of tank warfare on the Eastern Front, regardless of whether every single tank count in every single engagement can be independently verified against surviving Soviet archival records. But that value is enhanced, not diminished, by the kind of careful, source-comparing scholarship that has gone into reassessing engagements like Narva, work that neither simply accepts Carius's account at face value nor dismisses his entire career as fabrication, but instead does the harder, more valuable work of separating what can be corroborated from what cannot, and of understanding why and how wartime memories, even those recorded by fundamentally honest witnesses, tend to shift and grow in the retelling across the span of years and decades. It is worth cataloguing, for the sake of completeness, the full array of decorations Carius accumulated over the course of his combat career, since the list itself tells its own story about the sheer duration and intensity of his exposure to frontline combat. Beyond the Knight's Cross and its oak leaves, Carius held the Iron Cross First Class and Second Class, standard but still meaningful decorations awarded for gallantry in action, along with the Panzer Badge in silver, awarded specifically to armoured vehicle crews for participation in a set number of tank engagements, and the Wound Badge, which he received in successively higher grades as his catalogue of injuries grew across 4 years of continuous combat, eventually rising from the black grade awarded after his first wound in 1941 to higher grades reflecting the cumulative toll of the multiple serious injuries he sustained in 1944, alone. He also held the Tank Combat Badge at multiple levels, recognizing repeated participation in armoured engagements over an extended period, and the German Cross in gold, 1 tier below the Knight's Cross in the German honours hierarchy, but still reserved for demonstrations of extraordinary combat leadership and repeated acts of bravery, was held by several of his closest comrades within the 502nd Battalion, including Johannes Bölter, underscoring once again just how concentrated a density of decorated, battle-proven talent existed within that single unit by the middle years of the war. Taken together, this array of medals and badges represents, in the driest possible bureaucratic terms, an almost complete inventory of the German military honour system as it applied to a single armoured officer, a paper trail of ribbons and citations that traces, decoration by decoration, wound by wound, the arc of one young man's improbable journey from a rejected, underweight recruit to one of the most thoroughly decorated junior officers in the entire Wehrmacht. Let us return in these final passages to the question posed at the very beginning of this story. Was Otto Carius truly the deadliest tank commander of the Second World War? By now, having followed his journey from a rejected, underweight teenager in Zweibrücken through the frozen defensive lines at Narva, the smoke and chaos of Narva, the near-fatal ambush on the road to Daugavpils, the mechanical frustrations of the Jagdtiger in the collapsing Ruhr pocket, and finally into 55 years behind the counter of a small-town German pharmacy, it should be clear that the honest answer is more complicated and ultimately more interesting than a simple yes or no. The precise numerical tally of tanks Carius personally destroyed will likely never be established with complete certainty. Caught as it is between his own dramatic wartime and post-war accounts, the more conservative contemporary after-action reports filed by his own battalion commander, and the sometimes conflicting evidence found in surviving Soviet archival records. What is not in serious dispute is that Otto Carius was, by any reasonable historical assessment, one of the most tactically skilled, consistently effective, and remarkably fortunate tank commanders to serve on either side of the entire Second World War, a man whose documented combat record, even setting aside the most disputed individual claims, would be extraordinary by the standards of almost any other soldier of his era. What made him exceptional was not simply raw aggression or a willingness to court danger, qualities that, taken alone, tended to get tank commanders killed rather than celebrated, as the fates of contemporaries like Michael Wittmann and Kurt Knispel so starkly illustrate. What made Carius exceptional was a rarer and more valuable combination of qualities: careful, patient reconnaissance before committing his forces, a deep tactical understanding of how to use terrain and concealment to offset the numerical superiority of his Soviet opponents, a willingness to take calculated risks such as the decision to attack Narva with only 2 tanks rather than his full company, precisely because he understood the terrain well enough to know that fewer tanks deployed correctly would achieve more than a larger, more exposed force, and above all, an almost improbable, statistically defiant capacity to survive wound after wound that would have ended the war and the life of almost any other soldier. 7 bullets in a single ambush, a near execution at point-blank range defeated by a last-second turn of the head. Rescue by his own crew, arriving with only seconds to spare. These are the kinds of details that, if they appeared in a work of fiction, might strain a reader's credulity. That they are documented, corroborated, and consistent across multiple independent historical sources is a testament to just how extraordinary Otto Carius's wartime experience genuinely was, regardless of the specific, disputed tank counts that continue to generate debate among specialist historians and enthusiasts to this day. But perhaps the most genuinely remarkable and most easily overlooked aspect of Carius's entire story is not the war at all, but what came after it. So many of the most celebrated military figures of the Second World War on every side of the conflict either died in the fighting itself, like Wittmann and Knispel, or went on to lives defined in some significant way by their wartime fame, whether through political careers, veterans organizations, military consulting, or simply a public identity permanently anchored to their combat record. Carius did something quieter and, in its own way, more unusual. He built an entirely separate, entirely successful second identity as a small-town pharmacist, one that had nothing whatsoever to do with tanks, and he sustained that identity with evident dedication and evident satisfaction for 55 years, nearly 3 times longer than the span of his entire life up to the moment of his capture by American forces in April 1945. The Tiger Apotheke was not, in the end, a mere footnote or a curious postscript to his military career. For the residents of Hirschweiler-Pettersheim who relied on him for their medications across more than half a century, it may well have been the more significant and more consequential part of Otto Carius's life altogether, an ordinary essential service rendered patiently and consistently to an ordinary community, standing in quiet contrast to the extraordinary violence of his youth. There is a particular kind of moral and historical complexity in holding these 2 halves of a single life together. The decorated Wehrmacht officer who fought with genuine skill and courage for an indefensible cause, and the diligent community-serving pharmacist who spent the far greater portion of his adult life engaged in the quiet, unglamorous work of caring for his neighbour's health. Neither half cancels out the other. Carius's wartime service does not become less morally fraught because he later spent decades running a small-town pharmacy, any more than his decades of civilian service are somehow tainted or erased by the military decorations he earned fighting for the Third Reich in his early 20s. Both are simply true simultaneously, and reckoning honestly with a figure like Otto Carius requires holding that complexity without collapsing it into a simpler, more comfortable narrative in either direction, whether that narrative casts him as an uncomplicated hero of battlefield daring or as nothing more than another cog in a criminal military machine. History, and the individual human lives that make it up, rarely offer the tidy moral clarity that popular storytelling often prefers, and Otto Carius's long, strange, genuinely remarkable life stands as one of the more vivid illustrations of just how messy, contradictory, and ultimately human even the most extraordinary individual wartime stories tend to be, once examined closely enough and honestly enough. His legacy today lives on across several distinct and somewhat unexpected channels. Among serious military historians, his case has become something of a touchstone for discussions of memoir reliability and the challenges of reconstructing precise combat statistics from a combination of personal recollection, official after-action reports, and enemy archival records that frequently, and sometimes irreconcilably, disagree with one another. Among the broader community of military history enthusiasts, wargamers, and hobbyist model builders, Carius remains a genuinely beloved figure. His Tiger, and later his Jag Tiger, reproduced in scale model kits. His name attached to in-game achievements and special character rules in tabletop wargames played by hobbyists who were not even born until decades after his own combat career had ended. And his memoir still, more than 60 years after its original publication, widely read, translated, and referenced by new generations of readers discovering the story for the first time. And in the strange, unpredictable way that cultural influence sometimes travels across borders and mediums that its original subject could scarcely have anticipated, his story found its way into the hands of one of Japan's most celebrated animation directors, transformed into watercolor manga panels that carried Carius's own words and experiences to an audience half a world away from the muddy roads of Latvia, where his most famous battle actually took place. Otto Carius passed away on January 24, 2015, having lived a life of two genuinely remarkable, almost incongruous halves. A handful of years of extraordinarily intense, extraordinarily documented combat as one of the most skilled Tiger tank commanders the German army ever fielded, followed by more than half a century of quiet, steady, unglamorous civilian service as the pharmacist of a small village that most of the world would otherwise never have had any particular reason to know existed. He was 92 years old, and he died, fittingly, in the same community where he had rebuilt his entire post-war existence from nothing, surrounded, according to those who attended his funeral, by the people who had known him not primarily as a decorated war hero or as the celebrated author of an internationally best-selling memoir, but simply as Otto, their neighbour, their pharmacist, a familiar and reassuring presence behind the same counter for as long as most of them could remember. It is, in its own understated way, a fitting final image for a man whose extraordinary wartime story has captivated readers and historians for more than 60 years. Not a soldier frozen forever in the smoke and violence of his most famous battles, but an old man, at peace, at home, in the quiet German village where he had spent the far greater portion of his long and genuinely extraordinary life. It is worth returning, in these closing passages, to the technical machine that made so much of Carius's reputation possible in the first place, because the story of the Tiger tank itself is inseparable from the story of the men who crewed it. The Tiger's main armament, the 8.8cm KWK-36 gun, was derived directly from the famous German 88mm anti-aircraft gun that had already earned a fearsome reputation on earlier battlefields, including the deserts of North Africa, where it had been pressed into service against Allied tanks with devastating effect even before the Tiger itself existed as a production vehicle. Mounted in the Tiger's turret, this gun could fire an armor-piercing round capable of penetrating well over 100mm of armor at 1,000 meters, a figure that exceeded the frontal armor thickness of almost every Allied and Soviet tank fielded during the middle years of the war. Combined with high-quality German optics that gave Tiger gunners excellent visibility and targeting precision even at long range, the result was a weapons system that, when operated by a well-trained and disciplined crew like Carius's own, could engage and destroy enemy armor at distances where the enemy's own guns simply could not yet return effective fire. This technical advantage, more than any individual commander's raw courage or aggression, explains much of the lopsided casualty ratios that Tiger units like the 502nd Battalion achieved across dozens of engagements throughout 1943 and 1944, even as the overall strategic trajectory of the war continued to run inexorably against Germany. That said, technical superiority alone has never been sufficient to guarantee battlefield success, a lesson that the German army learned repeatedly and at great cost throughout the war's final 2 years. The Tiger's advantages in armor and firepower were offset by chronic production shortfalls, since the vehicle's complexity and cost meant that Germany could never produce Tigers in anything close to the numbers that the Allies and the Soviet Union were able to produce their own tanks. However individually less capable those tanks might have been in a one-on-one engagement. Fewer than 1,500 Tiger I tanks were ever built across the entire course of the war, a strikingly small number when set against the tens of thousands of T-34s that rolled off Soviet production lines during the same period, or the similarly enormous numbers of Sherman tanks produced by American industry. This meant that even the most successful individual Tiger commanders, men like Carius, Wittmann, and Knispel, were fighting what amounted to a desperate holding action, however brilliant their individual tactical successes, against an enemy that could simply absorb losses and replace destroyed tanks at a rate that Germany's own industrial base could never hope to match. Every Tiger that Carius's crews destroyed represented, from the Soviet perspective, one machine among an ever-growing multitude, while every Tiger that broke down, ran out of fuel, or was destroyed in combat represented an irreplaceable loss for a German war economy that was buckling under the combined weight of a two-front war and relentless Allied strategic bombing. This broader strategic context matters for understanding Carius's own place in the history of the war, because it helps explain why even his most spectacular individual successes, genuinely impressive as they were by any measure, could never have been enough on their own to change the war's ultimate outcome. Carius and his fellow Tiger Aces were, in a sense, fighting a rearguard action within a rearguard action, buying time, inflicting disproportionate casualties, and slowing the pace of the Soviet advance in specific sectors of the front, but never possessing anything like the numbers or the logistical support necessary to reverse the broader strategic tide that had turned decisively against Germany by the second half of 1943, well before Carius himself had even joined the 502nd Battalion. This does not diminish what he and his crews accomplished at a tactical level, but it does place those accomplishments in a more sobering and more accurate historical context than the more triumphalist tone that sometimes characterizes popular retellings of German tank ace stories. A tone that can inadvertently obscure just how hopeless the broader German strategic position had already become by the time Carius was earning his Knight's Cross and Oak Leaves in the fighting around Narva and Daugavpils. There is one more thread worth pulling on before bringing this story to its close, and it concerns the peculiar psychology of survival itself. Carius, in his later interviews, occasionally reflected on the sheer improbability of his own continued existence. A man who had been shot, by his own count, on multiple separate occasions across 4 years of continuous frontline combat, who had watched close friends and fellow crewmen killed or maimed in the same engagements that had left him alive, and who carried for the rest of his 92 years both the physical scars of those wounds and whatever psychological weight accompanies having stared down the barrel of an enemy pistol at point-blank range and lived to describe the experience in vivid detail decades later. How did a man process that kind of experience and then go on to build a quiet, orderly, sustained civilian life, marrying, raising a family, and serving the same small community for 55 consecutive years, as though the war had never happened at all? Carius never wrote extensively about this particular question, at least not in the parts of his memoir and later interviews that have been most widely translated and discussed, and it would be presumptuous for any modern observer to claim certainty about the inner emotional life of a man who has now been gone for over a decade. But the sheer contrast between the violence of his youth and the studied calm of his subsequent 6 decades stands on its own as one of the more quietly remarkable aspects of this entire story. A reminder that the men who fought World War II's most famous battles did not simply vanish back into ordinary life once the shooting stopped, but carried their experiences with them in ways both visible and invisible for the remainder of their long lives. There are a few final human details worth adding to this portrait, small facts that rarely make it into the more battle-focused accounts of Carius's career, but that help round out the picture of the man behind the legend. His family, it turns out, had a deeper connection to the war than even his own remarkable service alone would suggest. His younger brother, Wolfgang Carius, also served in the German armed forces during the war, initially as a tank gunner, before later serving in a tank regiment in Italy, meaning that the Carius household sent not one but 2 sons into Germany's armoured formations during the conflict. Their father, the elder Otto Carius, the schoolteacher who had once dismissed tanks as metal death traps, ended up serving as an officer himself, first in France during the 1940 campaign, and later in 1944 and 1945 as a reserve major and battalion commander on the Eastern Front in Russia. meaning that by the war's final year, virtually the entire Carius family, father and both sons, were serving in uniform simultaneously, a common enough pattern in a Germany that had, by that point, mobilized nearly every able-bodied man of fighting age, but a striking one nonetheless when traced through the specific lens of a single family's wartime experience. It is also worth returning briefly to the earliest of Carius's combat wounds, sustained on July 8, 1941, barely 2 weeks into Operation Barbarossa, because the specific circumstances add useful texture to the broader story of his baptism by fire on the Eastern Front. Carius's light tank was struck and knocked out by a 47mm anti-tank round after his unit had crossed the Daugava River on a pontoon bridge near the town of Ula, west of Vitebsk. The crew was forced to bail out under fire, and Carius himself was wounded in the face during the incident, losing several teeth in the process, a painful and disorienting injury that nonetheless did nothing to slow his subsequent rise through the ranks. It is a small, almost mundane detail in the grand sweep of a career, defined by far more dramatic later engagements, but it serves as a useful reminder that even Carius's very first brush with combat, in the opening weeks of the war's largest and most consequential campaign, very nearly proved fatal, a pattern of narrow survival that would repeat itself with escalating drama again and again over the following 4 years. On the personal side of his post-war life, Carius married a woman named Hannah, and the couple, by most available accounts, did not have children, choosing instead to build a life centered on his professional work at the Tiger Apotheker and on the close-knit community of Hirschweiler Pettersheim itself. He maintained throughout his long post-war decades a notably private family life, and he consistently avoided the kind of public political engagement that characterized some other prominent former Wehrmacht veterans in the post-war decades, whether through veterans associations with nationalist leanings or through more overtly political commentary on Germany's wartime past. This low political profile, combined with his evident dedication to his pharmacy and his local community, appears to have been a deliberate choice on Carius's part. A decision to build his post-war identity around steady, useful, apolitical service, rather than around any continued public role tied to his wartime fame, even as that fame, ironically, continued to grow through the international success of his memoir and its various later adaptations. Even in his final years, well into his 80s and 90s, Carius remained a familiar and approachable figure at the Tiger Apotheke, and visitors and researchers who made the journey to Hirschweiler Pettersheim to meet him in person, some as recently as mere days before his death in January 2015, consistently described him as gracious, sharp-minded, and willing to discuss his extraordinary history with a candor that belied his advancing age. Even the specific tank Carius commanded during his most famous engagements has taken on a life of its own within the world of military history enthusiasts and model builders. His Tiger, marked with the tactical number 217, painted on the turret in the standard German style of the period, has been reproduced in scale model form by multiple manufacturers over the decades, appearing in hobby shops and at model competitions around the world as one of the most instantly recognizable individual vehicles of the entire war, rivaled in that particular niche of popular recognition by only a small handful of other named tanks and their commanders. For a machine that no longer exists, long since destroyed, scrapped or lost to the passage of 80 years since the fighting in Latvia and Estonia, the number 217 continues to summon, for a very particular and very devoted community of enthusiasts, the entire story recounted in this video. The careful reconnaissance, the daring two-tank charge into a village held by a vastly larger enemy force, and the almost unbelievable survival of the young lieutenant who commanded it, 7 bullet wounds and all. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found Otto Carius's remarkable journey from a rejected, underweight recruit to one of the most celebrated Tiger tank commanders of the Second World War, and later to a small-town pharmacist who ran the same shop for 55 years, as fascinating as we did. If you enjoyed learning about the men who fought inside Germany's most feared armoured vehicles, make sure to check out our video on what happened to Germany's field marshals after World War II, where we cover the fates of the senior commanders who directed the very campaigns Carius fought in from the front lines of a Tiger's turret. And if the post-war stories of Germany's soldiers left you wanting more, don't miss our video exploring where the Waffen-SS went after 1945, which picks up many of the same themes of survival, reinvention, and reckoning with the past that defined Carius's own extraordinary second life. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the hidden and often surprising stories of the Second World War. See you in the next one.